You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is going to be a response to a listener email, and we're going to talk about some important misconceptions about financial independence and about going after any goal in general. But first of all, before we get to that, I want to say a huge thank you to my first patrons on Patreon. As I mentioned last week, I've just launched a Patreon page where you can support The Voluntary Life and get a whole range of bonus content and rewards. And I'm so grateful to the people who have already signed up. So I want to say a big thank you to Hannah B, Roger P, Cassie T, Rob C, Logan L, Brian S, Patrick, Roger B, Conrad S, and Marvin A. Those are the patrons who've signed up at the time of recording this podcast. If you have already signed up and you didn't hear yourself mentioned, I'm going to thank you in the next episode of The Voluntary Life. I also want to tell you about the things that I just released on Patreon this week. I've put out something special for my patrons every day over the last week. Most importantly, I put out the first patron-only episode, which was How to Sort Your Life Out Part 2. That was the continuation of this discussion of areas of responsibility. And I also provided my patrons with my own personal Evernote template for areas of responsibility. And that's the template that I use to organize my own productivity system when it comes to areas of responsibility. I posted a bunch of other stuff for my patrons. There's 3 ebooks of mine that I've given my patrons, and I've provided a breakdown of the running costs of the podcast to give you a look behind the scenes. So if you're interested in getting all those goodies, then please do sign up at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. And you'll find a link in the show notes and on my website, thevoluntarylife.com as well. So on to today's episode. And first of all, I'll read you out this email I received this week, and then we'll talk about some of the topics that it raises. And this is very relevant to what I was just speaking about because this listener wrote to me about his thoughts following the release of my Patreon page. And this is the first I've heard from this listener, but this is what he wrote. I've been a long-term listener, but honestly, I'm having a difficult time being a paid subscriber. I listen to several podcasts, and a similar characteristic seems to be financial independence and hosts who are millionaires. Provide real value for those who don't enjoy that status, and the money will come. There's too many of us who want to be financially independent, but don't have a system to get there. Figure out a way to teach the methods, and you'll never have to ask for donations. So that was the email. There are 2 things in this email I think it is worth discussing. The first thing is his feedback about me, The Voluntary Life, and the Patreon campaign. And I think he has some misunderstandings or misconceptions, which perhaps other people have too. So I will address them in case that's helpful. But the thing that I really want to talk about with this email is the second issue, which is his thoughts about his own struggle to find a way to achieve financial independence. And this is the more important comment, which I think other listeners could also get something useful from hearing me respond to. So first of all, let me just say something positive about this email. I think it's to his credit that this guy is thinking about whether or not to become a patron. He's a long-term listener, and he's heard that I'm asking people to become patrons of the show. And this is something that he's at least evaluating, which means he realizes that he's consumed a lot of episodes of The Voluntary Life and he's thinking about it. A lot of people just wouldn't even think about it. They get the show for free and they hear me talking about Patreon or something and it just goes straight past them. They don't even consider it. So it's to his credit that he is at least thinking about this and that he feels the need to provide a justification for why he doesn't want to support the show. Now, the reason that he gives doesn't make any sense to me because he says basically that he's not going to support the show because it doesn't provide real value. That doesn't make sense because he has already told me that he's a long-term listener. And it's a big commitment to be a long-term listener for a podcast. In economics, we have something called revealed preference and stated preference. Your stated preference is what you say you want, but your revealed preference is what you do. And I very much follow what people do, not what they say. And the fact that this guy's a long-term listener means that saying that he doesn't want to contribute because he doesn't get any real value from the show doesn't really make any sense to me. But I do hear something else in his comments about me being financially independent and his thoughts about that. I think essentially what he's also saying is, why should I give you any money if you're already financially independent? I think this guy gets something from the show. He's listened for a long time. He's thought about becoming a supporter of the show. I think he does think it's a worthy project, but he thinks to himself, why should I give this guy any money? Because he doesn't need the money. He's already financially independent, and I'm not financially independent, so why should I give him any support? Now, I could read a lot of different things into the tone and the way that he's conveyed that message, but actually I think this is a fair enough question, and I'm happy to address it. You know, I like honest conversations, so I'm very happy to talk about it. So I want to give you 5 reasons why you should support The Voluntary Life. Reason number 1, you should become a patron because I am totally going to make it worth your while. As you heard in the beginning, I am going to shower you with bonuses and extra content and special patron-only episodes. And you're not going to get those unless you become a patron. And obviously, like this guy, for example, has been a long-term listener. So clearly he likes listening to the show. And these are going to be especially juicy episodes that I will only be giving to patrons. So this is the most important reason why I think you should become a patron, because I'm going to make it worth your while. But I have 4 more reasons for you. Reason number 2, because if you don't support The Voluntary Life, you'll lose a great podcast. And this is because The Voluntary Life has to wash its face. Yes, I am financially independent, but The Voluntary Life as a project has to wash its face if I'm going to continue doing it, because I've got a lot of other projects that I could do with my time. And frankly, I would be making a lot more money if I wasn't devoting time to doing this. I'm happy to give my time because it's meaningful for me to do this podcast. I believe in the mission and I do want to help people to live lives of their own choosing. But I also think that it's irresponsible of me not to get the costs of the project covered. You know, when I started doing this podcast, I was an unmarried guy. Now I have a wife and a kid, and it's just not really responsible of me to do projects that don't pay for themselves. So that's why I've decided to launch the Patreon campaign. And in a way, I mean, I am sort of putting it on the line. It is make or break time this year for me with this podcast. I've either got to find a way of making it so good that you guys really do want to support it. And if I can't do that, then I really ought to hear what the market is telling me and devote my resources to something else instead that will actually pay for itself. Have you ever had that experience when you find a really good bit of free software and you use it every day and you just think, oh, this is such a useful tool? I want those free projects to start charging me something because I don't want them to go away. I want them to be self-sustaining. And it makes me nervous when I realize that I'm starting to rely on a bit of free software, because I think to myself, how is this going to continue into the future? So actually, I like it when projects that I find helpful start charging me, because I know that means they're going to continue. So here's reason number 3. You should support The Voluntary Life because I will make better podcasts if I get your support. And this is something that I have to cop to myself, that this comes from part of being financially independent, that I have become somewhat lazy and undisciplined when it comes to this aspect of The Voluntary Life. I've always asked for people to provide donations and support, but I'm not really pushed it or tried to apply market discipline to this project. And that is an integrity fail on my part, because I've written a book called Becoming an Entrepreneur with a chapter in it called Learn by Selling. And in that chapter, I talk about how vital it is to use the experience of selling to get feedback about what it is that you're providing. And I talk about in that book how selling itself is the most vital feedback mechanism about whether or not you're doing something of value. So this is long overdue for me to apply my own principles to my own project. So it's time for me to take my own medicine with regard to The Voluntary Life. And this is one of the things about being financially independent, is that if you don't have to make yourself vulnerable by putting yourself out there and saying either this gets paid for or it fails, then you can be a bit undisciplined about it. And I have been undisciplined about it. I've not tested myself with this project because I've not had to, but it is time for me to treat this as a project that has to wash its face or do something else. Reason number 4 is I'm not taking a paycheck from The Voluntary Life. So if it grates on you to think of someone who's financially independent getting paid for doing this, then you can relax, because I don't want a paycheck from The Voluntary Life. Not that I think there would be anything wrong with that at all, but it just so happens that I do plan to continue providing my time for free. Here's what I want the money for. Number 1, I want to get the running costs covered. That is really crucial. And then number 2, I want to fund growth and improvements to the show. That's why I want support. And I've got lots of ambitious projects that I want to do in terms of improving and expanding the show. Now, after that, at some point, it would be nice to get the sunk startup expenses covered and get to historic break-even on the project, because I think it's right that The Voluntary Life ought to be self-sustaining as a project as a whole. So that would be nice at some point in the future, but that's not my top priority. And then after all that, maybe sometime after that in the future, I'd like to get paid. And when we get to that future point, I'm going to be transparent about it. And you can always choose to stop supporting me then if you like. But believe me, we're a long way away from that with this project. So if it makes you feel better, I'm not taking a paycheck. Reason number 5 why I think you should support The Voluntary Life is because this podcast really does change people's lives. I get countless emails back from people saying that. So many people have listened to my show and have been inspired to become entrepreneurs. And I'm really happy to think of all the people that those businesses are now serving and employing and providing value to. I hear from people who've been inspired to start investing. People who write to me and talk about how they've taken their first steps in investing. I've heard from people who discovered Bitcoin through my show before the price went through the roof. And most importantly, on the investing side, I've heard of people who have now chosen to pursue financial independence because of what they've learned through my podcast. And it's always super exciting when I hear from people becoming financially independent or about to become financially independent and have found my podcast helpful in that journey. And I do hear from those people all the time, from people in that situation. But it's not just the financial side. The Voluntary Life is about creating a life of your choosing. And I hear from people who have been inspired to change their lives in totally other ways. I hear from people who have really taken on a passion for productivity in the way that I have a passion for productivity. And I mean, that's an aspect of the show I never expected to be talking about as much as I do. I hear from people who've been inspired to become minimalists and have been encouraged to free themselves from a lot of their stuff through hearing the show. I get all sorts of emails about people who found ways to more personal freedom in their personal relationships, difficult family situations which they've been able to see in a new light and stand up for themselves because of some of the things that they've heard on my show. This is a relentlessly constructive show, The Voluntary Life. I'm always talking about what I'm for and not what I'm against, and about things that you can do to improve your own lives. So if you're going to support any project, The Voluntary Life is doing good things in the world. And in the nature of things, there's always only a small fraction of people who are willing to help support something like this project. I do still want the free podcast to be out there and to be able to reach new people. And given that there's only a small number of people who actually do understand that projects like this need support, I really appreciate it if you guys who do understand that step up and help support the project. So that was the first aspect of this listener's email that I wanted to cover. So I hope you found it helpful to hear me address that question openly. And I hope that's cleared up any misconceptions. But the really important thing that I want to talk about is the second aspect of this listener's email, which was his thoughts about why he hasn't reached financial independence yet. He said, I listened to several podcasts and a similar characteristic seems to be financial independence and hosts who are millionaires provide real value for those who don't enjoy that status, and the money will come. There's too many of us who want to be financially independent but don't have a system to get there. Figure out a way to teach them methods and you will never have to ask for donations. So he wants me to give him a list of instructions that's going to make him rich. So in his mind, he's not financially independent yet because I haven't figured out a way to teach the method yet. So once I figure out a way to teach the method and give him a list of steps that's going to make him rich, then he's going to contribute to the voluntary life, or at least then I'm going to be rewarded in some way. That's his message. And what I want to talk about here is how your attitude is so crucial in any goal that you want to achieve. Let's think of the context of this email. This is a long-term listener who's written to me for the first time. All right, and he's told me that he listens to lots of podcasts on financial independence. So clearly he's very interested in financial independence. He's listened to my podcast for a long time. And that means he's had essentially a year-long course from the voluntary life. I've got nearly 300 episodes out there. If you take into account weekends and holidays, there's 280 working days in the year. So if you listened to the voluntary life on your morning commute every day, you would have a year-long course. Now, my show's not only about financial independence. I do cover topics relating to all aspects of choosing your own life. So I talk about freedom in personal relationships and freedom in family relationships, freeing your mind with rational thinking, living ethically, peaceful parenting, and all these other things. But still, as a long-term listener, this guy has probably heard a whole series that I've done on entrepreneurship about how to build a business. He's probably heard a whole series I've done on financial independence. I've done loads and loads of episodes on investing. I've talked about the permanent portfolio, passive investing, different asset classes. I've talked about other financial topics like Bitcoin. I've talked about 4 ways to quit the rat race and this idea that I have of different options that you have for choosing a lifestyle towards financial freedom that fits you. So it's not like I'm keeping anything from you here. I really am putting all my ideas out there. And here's a guy who wants to be financially independent, and he has a chance to talk to somebody who is financially independent, who's putting all these suggestions and ideas out there. And I'm an approachable guy. So here's his chance. He's going to contact me for the first time. And he could have been implementing and testing these ideas that I'm putting out all the time that he's been listening. He could have been trying to invest and starting to develop his own portfolio for passive investing. He could have been trying to start a business. He could have been doing all of these things. And when he chose to contact me for the first time, he could have said, hey, I'm really working hard on building a permanent portfolio, but I just don't understand this whole idea of these different asset classes and rebalancing, and I don't understand how it works. Can you explain that? Or he could have said, hey, I'm really trying to build my business, but I keep coming up against this particular roadblock, and I haven't heard you talk about this particular thing. That's the problem I'm having. But he didn't do any of those things. He wrote to me explaining that he's not going to support the voluntary life and that I need to find a way to teach a method for him to get rich. I mean, in terms of first impressions, he blew it, which means that he's also kind of blown an opportunity to get my help. And that's a shame, because he says he does want to become financially independent. And I'm really trying to help you guys to achieve your goals. So I want to share 2 quotes with you that I think are very powerful. I've found them very powerful, that are relevant for this question of attitude in going after your goals. The first quote is by an entrepreneur called Derek Sivers, who I really like. It's a very short quote, and it is simply this: if more information was the answer, then we'd all be billionaires with perfect abs. I love that quote because it really makes you think about it. Is the reason that I don't currently have washboard abs with a perfect 6-pack, is the reason that I cannot find the information out there on how to get perfect abs? No, that's not why I don't have perfect abs. Is the most important reason that you're not financially independent because I, Jake, haven't given you a checklist method for how to get rich? Come on, of course not. It's pretty obvious that the answer is no. Because for a start, I've put out 300 episodes. I'm doing everything I can to put my ideas out there. But your attitude, and I'm speaking now to the guy who wrote this email, your attitude is, I need you to give me a checklist that I can follow that's going to make me rich. And my response to you is, the reason that you are not rich is not because you don't have a checklist. Just as the reason that you don't have perfect abs is not because you don't know how to get perfect abs. The second quote that I want to share with you is by a psychologist called Nathaniel Branden. And I also find this to be a very powerful quote. Nathaniel Branden, when talking about personal development, had a very simple quote, and it is simply this: no one is coming to save you. Apparently, he once said that in a seminar, and a woman who was attending the seminar said, "But you came, Nathaniel, you came." And Nathaniel Branden turned around and said to her, "Yes, I came to tell you that no one is coming to save you." You have to take responsibility for your own journey, and you have to choose to be the hero of your own life. You can't look to other people, because as long as you're waiting for me to provide you with the magic set of instructions, as long as you're doing that, you're not actually trying to implement all of these ideas that I am giving you. Take the ideas that I'm giving you, rip them apart, put them back together again, find out what works and what doesn't, and take ownership of your own journey to financial independence or whatever else it is that you want in life. If you do want to build a life of your choosing, which is what the voluntary life is all about, you have to relentlessly keep trying and failing and trying again. And I know that that's not what you're doing because you didn't even bother asking me anything. So, my friend, my message to you is you got to find your moxie and get to work, because there's a lot to do and a lot of mistakes to make if you want to achieve the life of your dreams, including financial independence. And I am trying to help you with as much useful information as I can, but your problem isn't lack of information. I hope you guys found that useful, and I hope there's something in there that you can take from this. Please do become a patron of the Voluntary Life and help me to help as many people as I can to achieve the lives of their own choosing. This week I'm putting out another patron-only episode, and it's going to be a great one too. It is how to do a daily review. This is a part of my productivity system that I've not really spoken about very much, and it's probably the one I spend most time on, actually, given that I do it daily. So the daily review. I'm also going to put out more Evernote templates. I got some good feedback from my early patrons, and that's something that people like, so I'll be doing that too. So that's all for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode of The Voluntary Life. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.